Saudi Arabia has a mutual defense pact with Pakistan, so that if any are attacked, the other is obligated to come to each other's defense, okay?
Professor Jiang breaks down exactly how he believes World War III will begin, and he's pointing directly at a US ground invasion of Iran. This clip is worth your full attention.
Excited about what's happening. So again, you cannot look at this war from a geopolitical lens. You have to look at it from an eschatological perspective, all right? So let us look at where we are in the war so far. And as you can see, it is a regional war, and both sides are seeking maximalist objectives. And what this means is the United States and Israel wants to destroy Israel, especially its capacity to be a nation state. And so right now, the Americans and Israelis are attacking their leadership, decapitating their leadership, as well as targeting their economy. And later on, as this war progresses and escalates, they will start to target civilian critical infrastructure, including water, okay? And it's already happening. They also want to have a divide and rule strategy where they want to provoke ethnic conflict in Iran and divide Iran up into ethnic enclaves. And this is what we call balkanization. The Iranians, on the other hand, want to destroy the entire global economy. And you do that by attacking the energy infrastructure of the GCC. Because again, the entire basis of the global economy is cheap energy, okay? So as this war progresses, you will notice certain things, right? So eventually, the Americans will have no choice but to launch a ground invasion. And one possible attack vector is here, which is Kharg Island. This is where Iran stores about 9% of its oil for export. And so the idea is that if you take Kharg Island, you will destroy the Iranian economy and thus its capacity to sustain this war. The problem with Kharg Island is that it's easy to take, but it's hard to defend because of the coastline, right? In which case, you have to also take the coastline. But then you deal with the Zagros Mountains, and so you have to expand outwards. Okay, so this is what we call mission creep, where you cannot justify the war. So what you do is you put in some soldiers, and then the mission creep becomes just justification for the war. Okay, so that's one thing to spot as you read the news. Kharg Island will be a flashpoint. Another flashpoint will be Saudi Arabia, because right now the Iranians are attacking Saudi Arabia. Now, what Saudi Arabia can do is declare war on Iran. And this is important because Saudi Arabia has a mutual defense pact with Pakistan, so that if any are attacked, the other is obligated to come to each other's defense, okay? This is important because, as you can see, Pakistan opens up the eastern front, okay? So it's possible the Americans can attack from the east. The other thing that's important is that Pakistan has nuclear weapons. And it is possible nuclear weapons are used. I strongly believe tactical nuclear weapons will not be used, okay? But once Pakistan is in the war, nuclear warheads are now at play, okay? Another thing to watch is how this war expands elsewhere, okay? Because when the time is appropriate, what will happen is that the Iranians will activate their proxies, the Houthis, and they will close off another critical choke point, okay? So now what's going to happen is that there'll be two critical maritime choke points that are closed off, thus isolating the GCC and thus cutting off the world's access to cheap energy. And when they do that, we can expect global retaliation and other forces will have to come in to secure cheap energy. Okay, it is possible the South Koreans, the Japanese are forced into this war because they are so dependent on GCC energy. All right. So these are things that we will look for in the next few weeks. People are speculating that Benjamin Netanyahu is dead. And the reason why is that he's not been seen in a public setting for many days. There have been cabinet meetings and Netanyahu usually chairs them and he's not there, okay? The other thing is that there are fake AI videos of him giving speeches and it's pretty blatant these are fake. So people are speculating that he is dead and they're trying to cover it up. This is a picture of him visiting a cafe in Jerusalem to prove he's not dead. The problem is that this cafe is in a mountain and it will take him about like 50 minutes to drive there. So why does he go there? Why doesn't he just have a cabinet meeting or get on the phone with Donald Trump to prove he's still alive? All right. So, but I personally don't believe he is dead. He could be hiding somewhere or he could be injured. What we do know is that the Iranians are killing a lot of senior Israeli officials, including the head of Mossad, the spy agency. And Netanyahu's residence was also targeted in Tel Aviv. So that's a really interesting question. How are the Iranians able to target so many of the top leadership of the Israelis, okay? But not only that, but this is Ali Larijani. And he is the de facto head of the Iran war effort. And he was assassinated yesterday or 2 days ago. And the Iranians have confirmed this, okay? So he is confirmed to be dead. And analysts are extremely worried about this because he is a very pragmatic person. And so you can negotiate with him, right? So once this war reaches a certain point where both sides are exhausted, then it is possible to approach him and say, you know what, let's just negotiate a ceasefire. And he'd be willing to because he's very experienced. He's also very influential, so he's able to bring together the different factions of the Iranian government and negotiate a ceasefire. With him dead, it is now almost impossible to foresee a ceasefire. Okay? Let's discuss why you really don't want to do this sort of stuff. You don't really want to kill other nations' leaders, okay? And so let's just use an analogy. Let's imagine in the streets, there are two gangs at war with each other, okay? Gang A and Gang B, okay? Gang A, Gang B. And if you look at gang, they are structured as hierarchies, okay? But there's a lot of autonomy among the different sections, okay? And what holds the gangs together, of course, is the leader. So when these two gangs go to war, what they try to avoid is killing each other's leader. Why? Because a war is often used to achieve certain political objectives, right? And so the point isn't to kill everyone. The point is to negotiate a treaty that is most beneficial to you. And you do that by negotiating with each other's leaders, okay? Because they have the authority to implement the treaty. That's the first reason. The second reason is if you kill the leader, then more people, there'll be a competition to replace the leader, right? And during a gang war, the person who is most violent, the most extreme, will often become the new leader, okay? So by killing this leader, not only do you cause conflict among the gang, but you also cause a massive escalation in the conflict between these two gangs, and there's really no way out. That is why historically you do not target other nations' leaders, because then there's no off-ramp, okay? So by targeting Larijani, the Israelis and the Americans have ensured that there will be no off-ramp now. This war we fought to the bitter end. And unfortunately, as we discussed previously, that is the objective here. The Israelis and the Americans are interested in maximalist aims to destroy Iran permanently, okay? And the Iranians are also maximalist in that they want to destroy the global economy permanently in order to restructure reality itself. All right, okay, so this leaves us with three major questions that I want to look at today, okay? The first big question is, how are these leaders dying? It's not that easy to kill a leader, right? Because he's protected by security. And usually there are two ways to figure out where the leader is, okay? There's human intelligence, called HUMINT, and there's signal intelligence, called SIGINT. Human intelligence, signal intelligence. Signal intelligence just means electronic eavesdropping, where I listen in on your telephone calls, where I track your IP address, okay? And the Israelis and Americans are obviously very sophisticated in that. And the Americans and the Israelis are saying that we are using electronic surveillance in order to track these people down. I don't think that's convincing. I think the most important source, the most reliable source of information is human intelligence. Having spies embedded in local networks to spot for you where they are, okay? That's the best way to figure out where they are. So then this raises the question, how are the Israelis and the Americans getting this human intelligence, okay? All right, that's the first question we want to look at. How are these leaders dying? Second question is like, why are they dying? Like, what's the point of killing them, right? Because once they die, they can just be replaced, and they're often replaced by a more extreme individual, okay? So that's the second question we want to look at. And the third question we want to look at is, what does this mean for the war and the world? Okay? What do these decapitation strikes ultimately mean for how this war will progress and how this will affect the world in general, okay? All right, so those are the three big questions I want to look at. So to answer these three questions, I want to introduce a new idea to you, okay? It's called the law of proximity. The law of proximity, the idea is this. Whenever you play a game, you're not just playing one game. You're playing many, many different games. And the game that you choose to play is the one that is most proximate to you, the one that is most close to you. And that impacts your decision making the most. Okay, so that's a law of proximity. So let me explain to you what this means using an analogy, okay? Let's just use your life. You are playing actually multiple games every single day, all right? So let's examine this. The first game you play, of course, is the family game, right? So you might have parents and you have siblings, okay? And the game you're playing, of course, is to win attention from your parents. And to do so, depending on who your siblings are, you might use different strategies, including doing well in school or being a pain in the ass. Unfortunately, my kids choose to be a pain in the ass, okay? Yes. The parents are playing another game, which is social prestige, right? So they're competing against other parents to have the best family possible, all right? So, and then not only do you play a game at home, but you also play games at school, right? Right? So when you go to school, you're competing against your classmates for attention and popularity, but you're also playing a game in school to get the best grades so that you can get into a good college, right? Then you go to work where you're competing in order to win the favor of your boss and to be popular among your colleagues. Then you play a city game where you live in Beijing and you want Beijing to be better than maybe Shanghai or Shenzhen, okay? And then you play a game of maybe a nation where you want China to be stronger than Japan, okay? So as you can see, every single day you're playing multiple games, even though you may not recognize it. And again, what's important is the game that is most important to you is the game which you are most close to, right? The one that you can see in front of you. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, but this is also true for nations as well, where we think that the game is between nations, but really the game is within nations. And the conflict within nations is the one conflict that determines how nations behave against each other. All right, so today what we will do is we will look at three examples of this, okay? We will look at the civil conflicts in America, in Israel, and in Iran to figure out why they behave the way they do, and then figure out how this war will progress. Okay, so clearly there is a civil conflict right now in America. Okay, you have the Democrats and you have the Republicans. Now what's odd is that even though these two different political parties are at war with each other, they both support the war because their calculus is different. Okay? So why do the Democrats support this war? Well, it's because they believe that this war will be extremely unpopular in America, which will allow the Democrats to dominate in the midterms in November and then win the presidential election in 2028. And they believe that this war will be so unpopular, it will destroy Donald Trump and allow the Democrats to rule forever. It will basically destroy the Republican Party. All right? And so that is your strategy. And if you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. The Republicans have a different strategy, which is this war may be unpopular, and this war may make America lose, but it's okay. Why? Because in a time of war, the president has something called the Emergency Powers Act, okay? Emergency powers. Emergency powers allows the president to essentially suspend the Constitution and to suspend or delay elections. Also, the Republicans want to pass something called Safe America Act. Okay? The Safe America Act, which means that if you are a voter, you must present ID in order to vote. And you think that this is, well, reasonable, but historically, the idea of checking ID is a way to discriminate against minorities, right? To have police officers there to scare minorities. And that's traditionally how racism was enforced in America. Okay? So in other words, the Republicans have many different strategies of either cheating or manipulating the elections. They could also, I just say this, but if the war is going really badly, what they will do is call up a national draft and cancel the elections, okay? All right, so these are two different strategies going on. But as you can see, this is not really about America defeating Iran. This is really about the Democrats or Republicans trying to obtain power and keep it, okay? All right, but what's important for us to understand is that it's not just about the Democrats and Republicans at war with each other. There's actually a much deeper divide in America, okay? And this divide is a conflict between the elite and the counter-elite. Remember how we introduced the idea of elite overproduction, right? This is the Peter Turchin idea. And he argues that what leads to civil war is that you have too many elite who want to be the ones in power. Power is a zero-sum game, and therefore, when you have elite overproduction, they have to go to war against each other in order to have the power. And so, what's going on? Who are the elite and who's the counter-elite? Well, I mean, to put it very simply, the Democrats represent the elite, and the Republicans represent the counter-elite, okay? So, basically, the elite is the empire, and counter-elite is MAGA, which is America First. And so, they have two different ideals for America. The empire is to maintain the current global order, right? And MAGA is to retreat back into the Western Hemisphere and focus on Americans' core national interests. Right? They're also divided into finance and AI. Okay? So in other words, Wall Street are the main backers of the current elite, and then Silicon Valley are the main backers of the counter elite. Okay? So these people are interested in maintaining the status quo. They are interested in a revolution. Right? And so this is the main divide in America that will eventually lead to a civil war, like an actual civil war. Okay? But right now, they're fighting over foreign policy. So I will discuss this more in the future, okay? But I present to you now. So let me give you a concrete example of why they're fighting. Why are people in finance fighting with people in AI? And there's a very good reason. Because if you're able to control Washington, D.C., if you're able to control the levers of government, you're able to make a lot of money for yourself, okay? So let's look at this concretely.
The law of proximity framework, whatever the speaker calls it, is essentially a restatement of what IR scholars call the two-level game theory, originally developed by Robert Putnam. The idea is that international negotiations and conflicts are always simultaneously domestic political contests, and that leaders are constantly trying to satisfy two audiences at once: their foreign counterpart and their domestic constituency. The speaker's framing is less rigorous, but the underlying intuition is sound and actually quite important for understanding why wars happen and why they persist longer than pure rational calculation would suggest. The point about decapitation strikes is also grounded in real strategic debate. There is a substantial body of literature on whether killing enemy leadership shortens or lengthens conflicts. The empirical evidence is genuinely mixed, but the speaker's specific argument that killing pragmatic, experienced negotiators removes the very people who could eventually broker a ceasefire and replaces them with more extreme successors is a real concern that serious analysts raise. It happened in the Palestinian context with figures like Arafat's inner circle. It happened in various insurgencies across history. The gang analogy the speaker uses is simplified, but not wrong in its basic logic. Peter Turchin's elite overproduction theory is a legitimate, peer-reviewed concept from a serious complexity scientist and historian. Turchin argues, based on historical data across multiple civilizations, that social instability tends to correlate with periods where the number of people seeking elite positions outpaces the number of elite positions available. This creates intense intra-elite competition that eventually destabilizes societies. Applying this to the current American political moment is something actual academics are doing, not just podcast hosts. The finance versus tech framing of this divide, Wall Street backing the establishment and Silicon Valley backing a disruptive counter-elite, is a real and observable dynamic in contemporary American politics, however simplified. The general observation that both political parties can end up supporting the same war for completely opposite strategic reasons is also genuinely insightful and historically well documented. This is how you get bipartisan support for conflicts that the public is deeply ambivalent about. Here is where it becomes necessary to push back hard, because the transcript contains claims that are either factually wrong, wildly speculative presented as fact, or structured in ways that are deeply misleading. The opening line contains what appears to be either a slip or a fundamental confusion. The speaker says the United States and Israel wants to destroy Israel. This is presumably meant to say Iran, but this kind of loose, uncorrected framing is characteristic of a certain style of content creation where accuracy is subordinate to momentum and narrative flow. In a written analysis, you catch that. In this kind of spoken commentary, it slides by and plants confusion. Ali Larijani, as of the knowledge available, was not assassinated. He is a real and important figure in Iranian politics, a former Speaker of Parliament, a senior advisor to the Supreme Leader, someone who genuinely does represent a relatively pragmatic faction within the Iranian establishment. But presenting his assassination as confirmed fact, complete with the geopolitical consequences of his death, when there is no credible evidence this occurred, is not analysis. It is fabrication dressed in analytical clothing. This is one of the most dangerous things this type of content does. It takes a real person with real significance and invents events around them, giving the invented events the same weight and tone as the real background context. The Netanyahu speculation is similarly problematic. Speculating that a sitting head of government might be dead or seriously injured based on cafe visits and AI video suspicions while acknowledging personally not believing it, is a way of spreading a conspiracy theory while maintaining plausible deniability. The speaker gets to say, I don't believe it, but here's all the evidence that suggests it. That's not analysis. That's gossip with footnotes. The description of emergency powers in the United States is significantly inaccurate. There is no single Emergency Powers Act that allows a president to suspend the Constitution or cancel elections. Emergency powers in the US are real, but they are narrow, legally contested, and subject to congressional and judicial oversight. The idea that a president could simply declare an emergency and cancel elections has no serious legal basis in American constitutional law. Presenting this as a straightforward Republican strategy misrepresents how American institutions actually function. The characterization of the voter ID debate is also one-sided in a way that obscures real complexity. There are genuine, well-documented historical connections between ID requirements and voter suppression, and that history is real and important. But collapsing the entire contemporary debate into a simple racism enforcement narrative ignores the significant policy complexity around election administration, the differences between various ID proposals, and the fact that many democracies around the world use voter identification without producing the outcomes described. You can have a serious critique of specific voter ID proposals without the framing being this flat. The most important thing to understand about this transcript and content like it is not any individual claim, but the rhetorical architecture. The structure works like this. Establish credibility with real, verifiable, sophisticated sounding concepts. Turchin's elite overproduction, the two-level game, the logic of decapitation strikes, and then, using exactly the same tone and confidence level, introduce speculative or false claims. The listener's brain does not naturally distinguish between the two categories because the speaker isn't distinguishing between them. Everything is delivered with the same authoritative energy. This is distinct from lying in a straightforward sense. The speaker clearly has read things, has genuine frameworks they're working with, and probably believes much of what they're saying. But the epistemological sloppiness, treating rumor as confirmed fact, treating speculation as analysis, treating one possible interpretation of events as the obvious truth, is not a minor stylistic quirk. It shapes what the audience walks away believing, and it does so in a way that is very hard to unpack, because the real and the invented are so thoroughly intertwined. The deepest assumption running through this transcript is that every major actor, the United States, Israel, Iran, political parties, elite factions, is operating from a purely cynical, maximalist strategic calculation with no genuine ideological content. Wars happen because leaders want power. Political parties support conflicts because they see electoral advantage. Everything is a game being played by rational actors pursuing zero-sum interests. This is a coherent worldview, and it captures something real about politics. Cynicism about elite motivations is not paranoia. Elites do pursue self-interest. Wars do serve domestic political purposes, and geopolitical framing often does obscure narrower interests. But taken to its extreme, this worldview becomes its own kind of distortion. It cannot account for genuine ideological conviction, for miscalculation, for the role of fear and psychology and historical grievance, for bureaucratic inertia, for the simple fact that leaders sometimes do things that are strategically irrational because they believe them to be right. A framework that explains everything explains nothing because it has no predictive power. Any outcome can be retrofitted into the narrative of cynical elite manipulation. The maximalist framing that Iran wants to destroy the entire global economy, that the US and Israel want to permanently destroy Iran, also flattens the reality of how states actually make decisions. States pursue interests, and those interests are usually more complicated and more constrained than destroy everything. Even in the most intense historical conflicts, parties retained off ramps and had limited objectives they were genuinely willing to settle for. Framing every conflict as an existential total war makes the analysis dramatic, but makes it less accurate. Content like this is designed for an audience that already feels alienated from mainstream media narratives, that suspects elite institutions of coordinated deception, and that finds explanatory satisfaction in grand unified theories of geopolitical events. That's not a criticism of the audience. Mainstream media does fail in real and documented ways. Elite institutions do coordinate in ways that aren't publicly acknowledged. And the demand for coherent explanations of chaotic events is entirely human and understandable.